Good day, my name is Michael Malondo and I'm going to present on the subject of HIV-3, code HS30S3. The purpose of this presentation is just a preparation of the upcoming examination, and this presentation is divided into two parts. The first part is looking at how do you prepare yourself before you're going to write the exam, and then also looking at during the exam what you need to expect, what you have to do as part of your preparation. The second part of the presentation, or this presentation, will then also look at the content of the subject and then also looking at the examination scope. So let me encourage you at this stage that you are requested to go through the whole manual, which means from chapter 1 up to the last chapter. Despite the scope that I'm going to present, you are still expected to know the whole subject and then to read through the whole subject. So to start off, there are some practical guidelines that you need to know. Of course, you can have it all tailor-made. These are just basic guidelines, but at the end you have to design something that suits you much better. Now, before the exam, preferably I will suggest that you have to give yourself 2 months before the exam. And for the 2 months of preparation you have to come up with a timetable or a schedule that will help you to prepare yourself for the period of 2 months. Remember that this subject might be one of many other subjects that you are writing. So the more prepared you are, the better you are to write or to perform in the examination. So there are 3 things that you have to do for your preparation during the 2 months. The first thing is to read through all your subjects, the content of your subjects, to understand the chapters much better. Secondly is to make notes. The reason of notes is to better understand the content of the subject, and then it will also help you when you're going to do your revision to go through your notes, because your notes will look at words, concepts that you don't understand, so that you can have a better understanding. So, and then thirdly, a week before or 2 weeks, it all depends on you. You have to revise the subject or go through the subject to have a better understanding. So you are ready now, and the day comes where you have to write the exam. So all what you have now, it's the exam paper all in front of you and the script. So there are 4 things that you have to do. The first thing is to read through the whole exam papers, read through the whole 6 chapters. Remember, out of 6 chapters you have to only choose the 5. So after you have read through the chapters, then what you have to do is to choose or to select the 5 chapters or the 5 questions that are easier for you to answer. And after you have selected those answers, then of course you choose the answer that's the easiest for you, and you first start with that question. And then before you're going to write the question or the answer, is to read through that question again, just to understand. And then fourthly is then to answer the question. Don't interpret the question, don't assume this is what the question is, just answer the question as it is posed, and you will find it will be much easier for you than to write, and you might perform much better in the exam. Now, the second part of this presentation is we're quickly going to look through the content of the subject and what is then expected from you, and what areas you have to do to make sure that it is covered. And as I said earlier, this is just an examination scope. You still are requested to read through the whole chapter, to understand, to read from chapter 1, the last chapter, just to understand the content and the context of the subject itself. Because without it, it will be sometimes difficult for you to answer the question. It's better to have a holistic and a whole understanding of what the chapter is, of the subject is all about. So the first thing that you have to look at is you have to look at HIV/AIDS. What impact does it have in Namibia, in South Africa, in SADC, in the world, in Africa? then you have to see, is this impact negative or is it positive? You have to look at it. Does it make any difference? Doesn't it make any difference? Then you have to look at interventions. Are there any intervention when it comes to HIV/AIDS? What solutions are in place? What is being done to address the problem of HIV/AIDS within Namibia? So you discuss and look at the impact. Does it make any difference? And it's very important for you, when you are going to write on the impact, you have to look at current statistics. You have to look at what is in place, what is the current prevalence of HIV. You're going to look at the mortality rate. You're going to look at the rate of infection. You can also compare that to the other prevalences of like other diseases, co-diseases like TB, STI, STDs, and so on. So it's very important that when you are going to look at the impact, you have to have some figures. You have to quantify it with statistics to make sure whether HIV does have an impact. You can also look at the impact with regard to the education sector, impact in the health sector, impact in the mining sector, what impact does it have on agriculture, for example. So discuss all those things when you are going to get such question, or whether you're going to prepare yourself. So HIV does make a difference, or does have an impact on a country. Then, of course, besides the impact that it's having, what is being done to address these problems, or to address these problems or these challenges which is posed by HIV/AIDS or the HIV pandemic. So there are so many responses that are in place, and we also call that mitigation, which means solutions or interventions. Now, how, number one, you're first going to start is how does the Namibian government intervene to or respond to the HIV/AIDS outbreak, and what did the government put in place? And then you can also discuss the medium-term plans of the past. You can look at the National Strategic Framework, for example. So this is something that you have to look at when it comes to the response of HIV/AIDS. And then, of course, you're going to look, not only going to look at the response of the government, you're also going to look at the response of the private sector. What does the private sector do? What did they do in the past? And what are they currently doing? And what are they planning to do in the future when it comes to the response of HIV/AIDS? And then, of course, the civil society or the community-based organization, non-governmental organization, the NGOs, what did they do, or what are they currently doing as part of their response to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic? So you can look at different sectors, how they respond, and then also the mitigation potential that they have, or how do they mitigate to address this problem. Now, during this stage, you can also talk about the different policies that are in place. You can look, for example, starting from the Constitution up to the HIV national policy. You can look at different charters as part of mitigation effort to address the problem. So discuss in detail and give practical example how the response or the national response is being actually perceived. And then when you're also there, then you have to look at the lessons learned. What did Namibia learn through the experience in its past response for the last 20 years plus in its response? And then also, what does the government of Namibia put in place to address more effectively the HIV pandemic? So this is something that you can discuss in your paper with a practical exam, and then also to look at the different scope. So it's very important that you have to look into it. Then, after you have discussed now the mitigation and also the response within Namibia, you can also compare Namibia with other African countries. Did we achieve what we was actually supposed to do as a country? Did we reach the goal that has been put there. So this is something that you have to look at when you're going to discuss the response of HIV/AIDS. Then, of course, policy, and I've talked a little bit about policy. There are what we have currently. We've got the National HIV/AIDS Policy in Namibia. We've got the NSF, which is the National Strategic Framework in Namibia. Now, the question when you look at HIV/AIDS policies, you have to first look from a national level, and then you have to bring it down to sectoral level. What policies are in place? Then thirdly, when you talk about policy, you can also discuss the workplace policy. What is being put in place when it comes to the workplace? Are there policy in place? Do they exist? And then there are three things that you have to do when it comes to policies. First thing you have to discuss on the formulation of policies, whether it's workplace policy, whether it's national policy, how are HIV policies being formulated. So you can talk about the whole process that's involved, how everyone is being engaged, the different stakeholders, also looking at the issue of leadership commitment, management commitment. You can also look, for an example, at the social responsibility of private companies. Then, of course, which is very important, is the ownership, that everyone needs to have ownership when it comes to the HIV/AIDS policy formulation. Then, of course, is development of HIV policies. Some organizations, some ministries, so they already have HIV/AIDS policies in place. So what are you going to do when you are going to be appointed as a wellness officer or as a focal person in a company, and it is expected from you to develop this policy? What process are you going to do or going to take? What are you going to do, for an example, to make sure you're going to develop this policy? So you have to discuss this in detail as much as possible. Then, of course, you are not just going to formulate policy or develop policy, you're also going to implement. So talk about the implementation of HIV policies. What are the challenges that are being faced when it comes to the implementation of policies within Namibia? So as we know that there are so many policies in place, but what does implementation when it concerns about the implementation? And during the implementation of the HIV policy, also discuss what challenges are there to implement. Why are policies not being implemented? So discuss, give a list of challenges which needs to be addressed when it comes to the implementation of HIV/AIDS policy. What challenges do the government have, for an example? So there are so many challenges, whether it's financial challenges, whether it's institutional or structural challenges, or whether it's human resources challenges. So there are so many challenges when it comes to the implementation. So you have to discuss that in detail, give practical example about the implementation and also the challenges that are being faced as much as possible. Then, of course, you are going to touch also on the issue of the young people, the youth, looking at HIV/AIDS. Now, currently, when we look at the infection of STIs and STDs in Namibia, it's very shocking that it's very high in this country when it comes to STI, STDs, prevalences, and especially among young people. Now, the question is that does young people protecting themselves, and then what risky behavior does young people engage in order to expose themselves or make themselves vulnerable to HIV and AIDS? So discuss those issues of vulnerability of young people. Discuss the issues of the behavior, the risky behavior of young people, and how those risky behaviors can be changed in order to address the challenges of HIV/AIDS. So because when you look at the situation of young people, not just in Namibia but also in other African countries, you will find that the challenges are very similar. There is a similarity, and sometimes it makes it very difficult for countries to address. when it comes to the implementation of HIV preventive program or HIV intervention. So discuss this, as I said earlier, the vulnerability of young people, then also what the role young people or the youth can play in combating HIV/AIDS in a given country. Then, of course, you're also going to look at the whole issue of the triple 90. Now, triple 90, it's a UNAIDS initiative, which is actually a practical example and a practical suggestion for country to follow as part of their intervention. Now, the triple 90 it's an initiative, as I said, which is being adopted by all UN countries, which include Namibia. And all what it says is we want a 90% diagnosis of people that are HIV positive within a country. So you find some countries with challenges where the coverage of HIV diagnosis is only 20 or maybe 30 or 40% or 50%. So what UNAIDS says, it's countries have to raise their coverage of HIV diagnosis with at least 90%, because if we reach a 90% target of people that are being diagnosed by HIV/AIDS, then the chances are that we can actually manage the disease and also manage the newly infection incidence within a given country. So it's very important that 90% diagnosis needs to be reached, and it needs to be implemented by all countries, especially those that are signatories to the UN Convention. The second 90% looks at antiretroviral drugs or therapy. Now, what it says is in any country they want to have at least a 90% coverage of ART. Now, some countries are only having 50%, some only 70%, but there is a proposal on the table that countries must reach or at least a target of 90%. Now, it's very important, especially when it comes to these targets, that many countries, some countries feel that it's not realistic. But if you see now, since the late 80s up to now, it's almost 30 years plus that we are talking about HIV/AIDS and the response of HIV/AIDS. So this is something that we have to look at, looking at ART treatment. What about the issue of defaulting rate in a given country? Is the defaulting rate very high or is it low? And how does Namibia or any African country address the defaulting rate? So we don't just have then the diagnosis or the ART treatment, but we also have the viral suppression. 90% of viral suppression, and of course it all depends whether you're on ARVs. And when people are not on ARVs, of course, there's no way that they can suppress the virus. So instead of suppressing the virus, we allow the virus to mutate itself, and then the situation becomes more worse than ever. So very important, the 90, discuss it in detail. What does it mean? Go and study the UNAIDS initiative and how we can apply it in everyday life. And it's perfectly it is suggested that you have to go and look at other additional resources that talks about the 90 initiative as much as possible. Then, of course, you are also going to discuss about the workplace program. Now, workplace program, we have covered this so many times in the past about workplace program. All what it says is that every employer must have a program in place that speaks about HIV/AIDS, because it's not just the protection of the company itself, but it's also the protection of the workers or the employees themselves. So the HIV workplace program needs to be in place. It needs to be sustained. Companies need to be encouraged to have such workplace program. And then, of course, which is very important, that when you talk about the workplace program, you can also raise the ILO scope of workplace program, or the program of what ILO is putting in place. And then, of course, workplace program needs to be in line with the legal frameworks like the Constitution, the law labor law, for an example, and then also other international instruments. So it needs to speak to international instruments as much as possible. So if you want to have a workplace program, this is something that you have to discuss in your in your exam and so forth. Then of course we also going to talk about PMTCT. Nowadays, everybody talks about the EMTCT, which is the elimination. So we are not just talking about prevention, but we want to eliminate mother-to-child transmission. So this is an initiative that I think most countries can actually do. Now we know that, as I said earlier, about the 90%. Or the Triple 90 initiative, as I mentioned earlier, it actually also covers EMTCT, because we want to have at least 90% plus coverage of women that are pregnant. And some countries, especially in Africa, their coverages are very low, and then you still have a situation where children are born HIV positive. And in this current century that we're living with, the current knowledge we have, and also the availability of ARTs and ARVs, it is encouraged that we need to reinforce the EMTCT program in country as much as possible, so that countries can be ready. So discuss this in detail, and also give some practical example of other countries, and how EMTCT does play a very important role when it comes to the fight of HIV/AIDS. So I have then come to the end of my presentation. I hope that this presentation will help you to prepare for your examination, and I wish you all the best. Goodbye.